because there's really nobody keeping an eye on cost for consumers. And that was really what the PUC was supposed to do. They were supposed to be watchdogs.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of PowerGab, your Colorado-centric energy and environmental policy podcast. Our regular listeners and viewers may have noticed last episode with the book Shorting the Grid on the table. We anticipated having Meredith Engwin on this week as our guest to talk about that book and RTOs, but unfortunately we ran into some scheduling problems, so we are going to reschedule that interview for a later date. It will be soon. So instead, this episode is going to be all things about the Colorado Public Utilities Commission. Really exciting stuff. Before we jump into it, make sure that you guys are liking and subscribing to the IITV YouTube channel. Click the little bell to make sure you're notified every time we post. And be sure to check out our podcast wherever podcasts are available, from Spotify to iTunes. Joining me as always is Amy Cooke, my co-host. How are we doing this week, Amy?
Oh, living the dream. I'm looking at the water. Well, not at the swim, but the water's right out there on the coast of North Carolina. But I'll be back soon. So that's the beauty of being able to go back and forth. And actually being retired, I don't actually have to be in an office on any given day.
That's right. Our jet-setting co-host gets to go enjoy the beautiful weather in North Carolina.
No one hates flying more than I do.
Yeah. But speaking of Public Utilities Commission, the reason we wanted to dedicate an entire episode to this is it's something that I think you would agree with this, Amy. I don't think a lot of people really know what the PUC is. They probably hear PUC whenever there's some big rate hike going on in the news, and that's about it. That's pretty much the only time they think about it. But it actually is a really, really important regulatory agency that controls a lot about our energy policy and the prices we pay for things like electricity and natural gas. So I think it's important for the listeners and the viewers that we dive into it a little bit. We'll try not to get too wonky, but this stuff is important. So just sort of to set the ground floor, the Public Utilities Commission, PUC, we'll probably use those two things interchangeably. But what it is a three-member regulatory board that's tasked with, among other things, we're just going to focus on the energy side, but they do telecom, transportation, towing, that sort of thing. But they're primarily, for our purposes, focused on regulating electric rates and gas rates, because Colorado is a monopoly utility state. It wouldn't be fair to just give monopoly companies, carte blanche to charge whatever they want to customers that have no say in whose service they use. So in theory, there is a regulatory board that's supposed to set just and reasonable rates for customers in return for reliable electric service. So the mission of the PUC, I've got it pulled up here, kind of tells you a little bit about what they try to do. It says the Colorado Public Utilities Commission serves the public interest by effectively regulating utilities and facilities so that the people of Colorado receive safe, reliable, and reasonably priced services consistent with economic, environmental, and social values of our state. So I think that mission statement will provide a good jumping off point for you, Amy, because you have a lot more experience in dealing with the PUC, and you've actually been a party to some of the proceedings of the PUC, which is, I think, a unique experience that, quite frankly, by design, not a lot of people get. If you want to tell us a little bit about that.
First of all, most people haven't heard of the PUC for a reason, because it is one of these, I would call it sort of Kafka-esque, consumer unfriendly agencies that has an enormous amount of impact on your life. It's and when I say that, it's because they, to your point, that is who controls how much we pay for electricity or natural gas in the state of Colorado. It's intended to be a neutral regulator, just calling balls and strikes. It is not supposed to be, it is intended to be, I would say, weighted toward the party in power, because if you read its statutory setup in Colorado law, you said the three commissioners. Well, only two are supposed to be from the same party. One being from obviously the another party, the opposite party, or some other party. what we have now, what we used to have prior to that mission statement, which was changed about 2007, 2008, when Bill Ritter was in office, PUC chairman, an anti-nuclear activist, guy named Ron Binns, who was the chairman, actually changed that. At that time, there were 2 Democrats and a Republican on the commission. But it has since then morphed into this, instead of balls and strikes, it really is an activist agency. It is not, they're not neutral regulators. They aren't calling balls and strikes. They are actually have their heavy, a very heavy thumb on the scales. I wouldn't even say it's weighted towards like renewables. I'm going to flat out say it is designed intentionally to advance a specific agenda, this green agenda, or Colorado's agenda driven by Democrats in the state capitol and Jared Polis. It is designed to rubber stamp exactly what they're saying, what they want. And they're not neutral regulators, which is why we see so many in the public who are upset about their utility rates, because there's really nobody keeping an eye on cost for consumers. And that was really what the PUC was supposed to do. They were supposed to be watchdogs. Prior to the change of that mission statement, it was essentially they were focused on reliable, low-cost power. That was it. Reliable and low cost. That was what they were supposed to do. In exchange for a utility having a monopoly on their customers, the PUC was supposed to essentially represent ratepayers. That's what, and they were the watchdog. Well, that mission statement, as you said, think about this: reasonably priced, consistent with the social, economic, and environmental values of the state. Well, are we going to, the social, who's deciding that? Well, we know who's deciding that right now. And that person sitting in the governor's mansion, and then they're at the state capitol, and they are impressing upon the PUC their values. And Governor Polis has appointed people to the PUC who agree with them. And these are not regulators, they're not neutral regulators, they are activists. We have 3 of them. What Chairman Eric Blank out of Boulder, he is a lawyer who was part of Western Resource Advocates and has been involved in the renewable energy industry. Then you have Megan Gilman, who owned a company, who was a renewable net zero energy consultant. Then you have Tom Plant, who is an activist out of Boulder. So you have 2 from Boulder, you have 1 from Edwards, and they're all from the far left, progressive end of the political spectrum, and they are consistent with the agenda that is coming out of the governor's mansion and the state capitol, which is 100% wind and solar. So there's nobody in there that's acting as a check. Now, you might have the staff doing that, but the people in charge, there's nobody who was saying, maybe we ought to think about this. Maybe we shouldn't go 100%. What I get the feeling is they act more like they would rather be sort of renewable energy ambassadors rather than, or cheerleaders rather than neutral regulators.
Sorry, just to jump in right there.
I say that as a setup to, because of that, costs have gone up dramatically. There have been, reliability is decreasing. And now what you see is a public that is upset, and they're upset because the mission of the PUC has changed. And as a result, customers are now starting to feel that.
Right. No, there's definitely a lot to unpack there. In terms of, like you said, the mission, how much the mission change has sort of suffused everything that goes on at the PUC. So there is supposed to be a separate entity that's supposed to, in theory, serve as the watchdog for ratepayers as well. It used to be called the Office of Consumer Counsel. Now it's the Utility Consumer Advocate, which is its own independent state agency that's supposed to push back on rate increases requests from folks like Excel or Black Hills. And they're supposed to be advocating on behalf of the ratepayer. And even they have, I don't know if there's any mission statement for them or this, but I've at least witnessing these parties these proceedings go on firsthand. They say that, oh, well, we have to weigh some of these rate requests with environmental goals, the state's environmental goals, which, you might say fair enough. Perhaps environmental goals are a trade-off that is worth considering. But even so, that's still one more factor that's not being put into the ratepayer column. There's no one solely looking out for the ratepayer's bottom line anymore unless an independent group gets granted access to these proceedings, which you were at one point able to do so, but other times it hasn't been so easy for us to get involved to try to advocate on behalf of ratepayers.
Yeah, yeah, and that's when I say Kafkaesque, that's what the PUC has become. It is. We also did an entire case study on this, Jake. We'll drop those in the show notes, but the Independence Institute did a case study on what it's like to intervene at the PUC, because we intervened at the PUC. And just to let you all know, the PUC is like a playground of insiders. It's regulatory attorneys, it's quote stakeholders, always one of my favorite terms, because that just means you and I are excluded. Those are the stakeholders are the people that get invited to the table. It's usually all the environmental left and utilities, and they go behind closed doors and they have their meetings, and then they come out with some kind of agreement, and they have a press release, and they slap each other on the back, and yay, we came to an agreement. Just know that when they came to an agreement, you and I, our bills just went up. And that's what people are responding to now. They haven't been involved in that. And so we did intervene. It was expensive, about $500,000 when that was real money. Back in, I think that was 2018, roughly 2017, 2018. It was Xcel Energy's Colorado Energy Plan. We hired, and the reason it's so expensive is you have to hire an attorney. You can't just go and intervene. You can't. They won't let you. You actually have to have an attorney represent you, and to be taken seriously, it has to be a regulatory attorney who has an expertise in this area, and that is expensive. And in Colorado, there aren't very many of them, so most of them are conflicted out. So we went to Texas. We had to go to Texas to find one, found a great one. Then we also hired an expert witness, which, by the way, we got a lot of compliments on the strength of our arguments and our positions that we were making, and the knowledge of the expert witness. Our point was Xcel wanted to come back and prematurely shut down Comanche, the coal fire power at Comanche 1 and 2. And we argued that there was no need to do that because it didn't make economic sense. And what we found were modeling errors in Xcel's plan. They had to go back and redo about $88 million. And ultimately, what was funny, it's like everybody agreed that we were probably right, and that we brought great arguments to the table and everything. But what you don't know is that it is so heavily weighted. The decision's already made, right? Before you even get in there. You can make great points and you can try, but the decision was made. And Xcel was going to get what it wanted, and it did. Regulatory capture is very real, meaning utilities, they rub elbows with the regulators, and they they're the ones who are always there, and they have the access, and the average consumer doesn't. And to your point about the Consumer Council. I can't remember. It's got a new name. I was on it for about like literally a nanosecond right before I went down to North Carolina. It was an 11-member board. As you might imagine, I was the sole person who'd just be like, anybody thought about ratepayers? And I usually was the one. They would come back and say things like, oh yeah, we support this new plan. So they would actually go and they were always granted standing, and but they'd show up and say, yeah, we think it'd be great if XL did this, this, and this. And yeah, go ahead and raise rates. Or they might come back occasionally and say, it's a little high. We disagree with this one part. But there was nobody that was just a no person who would at least be the person who was asking hard questions. And I found that it's disappointing, but it's in desperate need of reform. And when we did our case study, we actually suggested some reforms that we should be looking at for the Public Utilities Commission. And one is to have an honest broker who could be a challenge on behalf of ratepayers. That was one. The other one was to set up a fund where ratepayers who want to intervene could actually intervene, would have the resources to intervene. But I think because of what it has become, that's why you're seeing opposition. There's a Facebook page, and it's Coloradans against XL, Black Hills, and the Public Utilities Commission, the PUC, which is hilarious because 10 years ago, nobody even knew who the PUC was. Now people know who they are. But with that, like I said, regulatory capture is real, but we've morphed into something even more now in Colorado. It isn't even regulatory capture, it is activist capture. This is now, the PUC is simply the playground of activists. It is where the eco-left activists, it's where they can do hashtag winning, because they get what they want. And that's by design from the governor and the legislature. So as much as you dislike the PUC, people who are responsible for it are the governor, Jared Polis, and state lawmakers. Those are the people we need to take this up with.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great point, because it is worth pointing out to the listeners here that the PUC on its own doesn't originate any of this stuff. Right? It's lawmakers at the Capitol pass a bill that says XL, or they usually don't call out the utilities by name, but they'll say, electric utilities shall do this by X date, and then they kick it to the PUC and say, okay, you make sense of the details and make it work somehow. And that's when it gets into these closed door. Literally, there's NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, for all the parties to these quasi judicial proceedings. That's why you have to be granted special intervener status if you've got the money. And even if you've got the money, they can still tell you no. They can still say, well, we don't think you have a reason to be a party to this, so we're not going to let you. And that's happened. I know that's happened to us in the past, before my time.
Wrap your mind around that. You have to petition to intervene, to have your say. You have to actually ask permission. You need a lot of money to be granted, and they may or may not grant you intervener status. If they think they know who's funding you and they don't like it, they won't allow you to come.
Right.
That they won't allow you to come. I mean, if they don't like who you are, you don't get to intervene. I mean, think about that. It's affecting your pocketbook. So you have to petition, intervene. They either grant you status or not. They can deny you. Yes, we've been denied. And then they can decide, the other thing is the utility, if they think you're effective, what they'll do is drag it out so that it drains your resources, which is the other thing that they can do. It is completely stacked against the average ratepayer.
It really matters, right? Because, utilities like XL and Black Hills, they can't build anything. They can't go out and build their wind and solar and transmission lines until they get the PUC's say so, right? So it really does matter how these proceedings turn out. It really does matter who's granted the opportunity to challenge certain expenses or point out maybe, hey, there's some other interests here that you're not taking into consideration. So this stuff really does matter, because the PUC ultimately gives their final stamp of approval for, okay, Xcel, go ahead and spend $10 billion building wind and solar, and we'll allow you to profit 8% off of all those investments, which means, you and me, the average Xcel customer, your bill goes up by, X dollars per month for the foreseeable future off of these decisions that happen behind closed doors, and they intentionally make it that way.
And that's the other thing you said, when you intervene, you have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, which means, so you'll find out all kinds of stuff, but you can't tell any of it because
Right.
you've signed an agreement not to tell. So this stuff is happening behind closed doors. And when you do find out, you can't say anything about it, other than what is made public. But a lot of that stuff gets heavily redacted.
Yep.
And they say it's for proprietary reason. What started off as what was supposed to be sort of healthy tension has become a cozy playground where the more, the PUC granted Xcel or Black Hills or any other utility, but I'm going to throw out Xcel because they're the biggest offender, whatever it wanted. And that means literally, the 10% rate of return. I wish it was only 8%. I don't know, maybe it's changed, but it was pretty close to 10%. But do the math. So they loved building new stuff, and they wanted to shut down Comanche prematurely. Why? Because they can get the accelerated depreciation. The PUC would give it to them, and then they could build all of this new wind and solar and batteries, and they would tell the legislature and everybody, oh yeah, we can do what you want. Yeah, we can we'll get really close to that 100%. So they could build, and if they get a 10% rate of return on their asset base, do the math, 10% of 10 billion versus 10% of 5 billion. Well, you've got a pretty good rate of return for your shareholders. It was a redistribution of wealth from ratepayers to shareholders through the PUC. And the PUC system needs reform. It desperately needs reform. That being said, I mean, I'd argue there are systems that are worse, believe it or not. I hate to say it.
No, I like the way you put that. Just as we're getting up close to time on this episode here, what are 3 major takeaways that you would want to leave listeners with as we kind of dive into the inner workings of the PUC? What are the 3 big takeaways you think listeners should get from this episode?
Yeah. So one thing, just know this. I'm going to say this every time. We do this so you don't have to. I literally went through brain damage going to the PUC so that other people wouldn't have to. Okay, 3 big takeaways. Yeah, I actually wrote some down, and the PUC has changed its mission, and we should know that. The PUC changed its mission with Bill Ritter and the whole new energy economy, and that really changed the course of since roughly 2008. So the last 16 years, and we are feeling it profoundly right now. So that mission change from affordable, or I would say least cost and reliable power, to reasonably priced, consistent with social, environmental, and economic values of the state, that changed everything. That changed their focus. They aren't neutral regulators anymore. They're not calling balls and strikes. We don't have the best and brightest sitting on the PUC commission. These are activist cheerleaders with an agenda that they use. They see the PUC as a conduit for it. But I will say this soon, as bad as all of that is, and it needs reforming, The good thing about the PUC is that it's in Colorado. We know who they are and we know who's responsible and who can fix it. What the problem is, and this is the third takeaway, is that's going to change. And the PUC will have no authority. And the problem with that will be, Jake, is that Coloradans will not know to whom they can go to even petition. There will be no petitioning government. That Colorado is looking to cede its authority to something called a regional transmission organization. And that we're going to cover in another show. But I will say this last thing, and I'm going to say it every single show: get your generator.
Always sage advice.
Get your generator, and have multiple fuel sources.
Yeah, diversity of energy sources is good. But that's all we've got time for this week. Thanks again, everyone, for listening to PowerGab or watching us on YouTube. If you haven't watched us on YouTube yet, be sure to check us out on IITV, the YouTube channel where we post this podcast, the video feed. If you prefer audio, we're available wherever you get podcasts, from Spotify to iTunes to Amazon, you name it, we're there. And if you like what you hear, please be sure to share with your friends, family, anyone you think might be interested in wonky Colorado energy stuff. We're the only podcast out there focusing on this stuff with a Colorado-centric perspective in mind. So I think it's an important value add if you care about the future of energy in this state. But until next time, we'll see you guys.